A quiet neighborhood turned into a battleground when Rick Pearson, a self-proclaimed HOA president, began extorting his neighbors with fake fines and forged documents. His arrogance and greed left families intimidated and out of pocket, until Daniel Moore decided enough was enough. Armed with undeniable evidence and unshakable determination, Daniel fought back against Rick's schemes. But just wait until you hear how this shocking story unfolded and why justice ultimately prevailed in the most satisfying way. It was a peaceful autumn morning in Austin, Texas. Daniel Moore stood on his porch, coffee in hand, soaking in the serenity of his new home. This house symbolized a fresh start, a space where he could design the life he had always dreamed of. But that peace was shattered when he opened his mailbox and found a bright yellow envelope marked "Immediate Action Required." Inside was a letter demanding a $500 fine for an unauthorized fence on his property. Daniel frowned, glancing out at the old, weathered fence that had been there long before he moved in. Confused, he flipped through his home documents and confirmed what he already knew. His property wasn't under an HOA's jurisdiction. Perplexed, he called the number listed on the letter. On the third ring, a gruff voice answered. "Rick Pearson, HOA president," the voice barked. "Hi, this is Daniel Moore from 1827 Maple Drive," Daniel began cautiously. "I received a letter about a fine, but my property isn't part of an HOA," Rick interrupted, his tone smug. "It is now. We've expanded the HOA, and all properties in this area are required to follow the rules. Pay the fine, or it doubles next month." "Expanded? Without my consent?" Daniel said, his confusion giving way to anger. Rick chuckled dryly. "You'll find it easier to just pay up. Don't make this harder on yourself." The call ended abruptly, leaving Daniel stunned. His neighbor, someone he'd barely exchanged pleasantries with, was now claiming control over his property. Determined to make sense of the situation, Daniel spent the rest of the day combing through his documents. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Rick had no right to impose these fines. As the sun set, Daniel's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about standing up for what was right. Little did he know the fight was only beginning. Sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents, Daniel felt his initial confusion harden into determination. He wasn't the kind of person to back down, and something about this so-called HOA felt deeply wrong. He started digging into the history of his neighborhood. After hours of research, he discovered that the original Homeowners Association had been officially dissolved years ago due to financial mismanagement. Rick Pearson's new HOA was unregistered and had no legal authority. Daniel decided to talk to his neighbors to see if they had experienced similar issues. His first stop was Mrs. Parker, an elderly widow who lived at the end of the street. Her home was warm and inviting, with family photos lining the walls and the scent of freshly baked cookies in the air. But her story was far from comforting. "Rick showed up last month with this," she said, handing Daniel a crumpled letter demanding $1,000 for late dues. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued. "He said if I didn't pay, he could put my house up for auction. What choice did I have? I paid it." Daniel clenched his jaw, anger bubbling inside. "You know that's illegal, right? No one can just impose fines or threaten to sell your home." Mrs. Parker gave him a weary smile. "I know now, but at the time, he made it sound so official. He even used those fancy HOA seals on his letters." Daniel thanked her for her time and moved on to another neighbor, Sam, who lived across the street. Sam greeted him with a grim expression, immediately pulling out a stack of papers. "You're not the only one dealing with this," he said, showing Daniel a letter with the same phony seal. This one claimed Sam owed fines for unauthorized landscaping and warned that non-payment could result in legal action. "What's worse," Sam added, "he sent this." He handed Daniel a letter claiming Rick had the right to auction properties for unpaid dues. It looked convincing, but Daniel spotted several red flags, including misspelled legal terms and vague citations of HOA regulations that didn't exist. The more Daniel uncovered, the clearer it became. Rick wasn't just overstepping his boundaries. He was running a full-blown scam. Armed with this new information, Daniel confronted Rick on his driveway later that evening. "Rick," Daniel called out, holding up a copy of the fake letters. "Care to explain why you're sending these to the neighbors? You have no authority to enforce anything." Rick turned to him, smirking as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Go ahead, try to fight it. Nobody wins against the HOA. Just pay your fines like everyone else and move on. Daniel stared at him, incredulous. You're not even running a real HOA. You're making this up as you go. Rick simply shrugged. Prove it. That was the final straw. Daniel returned home, his frustration fueling his resolve. He began documenting everything, letters, conversations, even the veiled threats Rick had made. The next morning, he contacted a local attorney explaining the situation in detail. After reviewing the evidence, the attorney confirmed Daniel's suspicions. Rick's HOA had no legal standing and his actions were fraudulent. Together, they began building a case, but Daniel knew this fight wouldn't just be about him. He was standing up for everyone Rick had bullied into silence. The battle was far from over, but Daniel was ready to take the next step. As Daniel's resolve grew stronger and the neighborhood began rallying behind him, Rick Pearson decided to double down on his tactics. What started as intimidating letters soon escalated into bold, shameless acts of harassment. One afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to find his car missing from the driveway. A sinking feeling gripped him as he noticed a fresh piece of paper taped to his door. It was a notice, claiming Daniel's car had been towed for violating HOA parking regulations. The absurdity of the claim didn't make it any less infuriating. Daniel clenched the paper in his hand, his mind racing. There were no HOA rules, let alone parking regulations, that applied to him. Yet here he was, left to figure out how to retrieve his car and deal with Rick's growing hostility. The next evening, Daniel caught Rick red-handed, trespassing in his backyard with a camera. The glow of a flashlight darted across his lawn, and there Rick was, snapping photos of his property. Daniel stormed out of the house, his voice firm but controlled. Rick, what are you doing on my property? Rick turned, completely unfazed, and smirked. Just documenting violations, he said casually, waving the camera before retreating into the shadows. Furious, Daniel immediately called a friend, Alex, who worked in IT and had a knack for uncovering digital breadcrumbs. The next day, Alex came over, and together they began digging into Rick's online presence. What they found was both shocking and deeply disturbing. Rick had been funneling all the so-called HOA dues and fines into a personal bank account. The payments neighbors had made in fear of losing their homes were being used to fund Rick's lavish lifestyle. Expensive electronics, luxury trips, and even renovations on his own house. Alex dug deeper, uncovering a trail of forged documents Rick had been using to assert control over the neighborhood. The supposed legal notices and eviction warnings were nothing more than scare tactics, crafted to intimidate residents into compliance. It was all a house of cards, and Daniel now had the evidence to prove it. Sitting at his dining table that night, Daniel felt a mix of anger and resolve. He knew Rick wouldn't stop unless someone stood up to him. Glancing at the growing pile of documents and evidence, he thought of his neighbors, Mrs. Parker, Sam, and the others who had quietly endured Rick's bullying. This wasn't just about his home anymore. It was about standing up for the community. Daniel looked up at Alex and said, "We're going to take him down. This ends now." With every piece of evidence, Daniel felt closer to exposing Rick's lies. The stakes were high, but he was ready for the battle ahead. Little did Rick know, his time was running out. The day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Neighbors filled the benches, eager to see Rick Pearson finally held accountable for his actions. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer, Sarah, flipping through the meticulously organized evidence they had compiled. Despite the weight of the moment, Daniel felt a quiet confidence. Everything they needed to expose Rick's schemes was in their hands. As the judge entered, a hush fell over the room. Rick sat at the defense table, his usual smug demeanor faltering under the pressure. His once confident smirk had been replaced by a nervous fidgeting as he shuffled through his own papers, clearly unprepared for the storm about to hit. Sarah began her case with a clear, powerful statement. "Your Honor, this is a case of fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. We will prove that Mr. Pearson created a false homeowners association to extort money from unsuspecting residents." The first wave of evidence was damning. Sarah presented the forged HOA documents, highlighting inconsistencies and glaring errors that made it clear they were fabricated. She played audio recordings of Rick's threats, including the time he told Daniel, "Just pay the fines or things will get more complicated." But the real blow came when Sarah unveiled the financial records. Using subpoenaed bank statements, she showed thousands of dollars in HOA dues, funneled directly into Rick's personal account. The audience gasped as the details were laid bare. Rick's vacations, shopping sprees, and home renovations, all paid for by his neighbors' fear. One by one, Daniel's neighbors took the stand, their testimonies painting a vivid picture of Rick's intimidation tactics. Mrs. Parker described the day Rick showed up at her door with a demand for $1,000 and a thinly veiled threat about her home being auctioned off. Sam testified about the doctored letters he'd received, claiming he owed fines for landscaping violations that didn't exist. Rick's lawyer tried to mount a defense, claiming there had been misunderstandings and clerical errors. But under cross-examination, Rick's lies unraveled. When asked about the forged documents, he stammered, unable to explain their origins. When confronted with the bank statements, he tried to shift blame, saying, "It wasn't just me. Other people were involved." The judge leaned forward, his voice stern. "Mr. Pearson, this court has seen no evidence implicating anyone else. The evidence overwhelmingly points to your direct involvement in these fraudulent activities." By the time closing arguments were made, the outcome was clear. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. This court finds Mr. Pearson guilty of fraud, trespassing, and harassment. His actions represent a blatant abuse of trust and an assault on the rights of his neighbors. He will be required to repay all fines, cover legal fees, and provide additional damages to the plaintiffs. Furthermore, this fraudulent HOA is officially dissolved. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of relief and satisfaction as Rick slumped in his chair, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Daniel felt a wave of vindication wash over him. It wasn't just about the victory. It was about standing up for what was right and showing his neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the warm sun on his face felt like the start of a new chapter, one where justice had finally prevailed. The air in the neighborhood seemed lighter after the courtroom ruling. The fraudulent HOA was officially dismantled, and Rick Pearson's reign of intimidation was over. His once pristine yard now stood neglected, a symbol of his fall from power. The for sale sign planted in front of Rick's house drew the attention of passing neighbors, who no longer avoided eye contact but exchanged knowing smiles. Daniel walked down the street that evening, feeling the shift in the community. Where there was once fear and silence, there was now unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another were sharing stories, laughing, and even making plans to host a block party to celebrate the end of Rick's schemes. Mrs. Parker was one of the first to express her gratitude. "Daniel," she said with a warm smile, handing him a plate of cookies, "you saved us all. I can finally sleep at night knowing he won't come knocking again." Her words filled Daniel with a quiet pride, but he simply replied, "We all stood together. That's what made the difference." The following weekend, Daniel stood on his front porch, sipping a cup of coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. The golden light bathed the quiet street, now filled with a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. He looked at the fence that had started it all and chuckled softly. It wasn't just a fence. It was a reminder of the battle he had fought and the justice he had helped bring about. His phone buzzed with a message from Alex, his tech-savvy friend who had been instrumental in uncovering Rick's fraud. The message read, "Victory feels good, doesn't it? Let me know when the party is. I'm bringing the snacks." Daniel laughed and shook his head, replying with a simple, "You're on." As he sat down on his porch swing, Daniel reflected on the journey. It hadn't been easy. There were moments of frustration, anger, and doubt. But through it all, he had stood firm, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged. The victory was about more than defeating Rick. It was about restoring a sense of fairness and integrity to the neighborhood. It was proof that even in the face of manipulation and greed, standing up for what's right can make all the difference. Justice had prevailed, and Daniel knew one thing for certain. This neighborhood was finally a place where he, and everyone else, could truly call home.